Hi, it's Katrina. Martian life. Hidden organisms found in the Arctic could be similar to life in space. Microbes discovered near the North Pole in Canada, buried in the surface sediment near a place called Lost Hammer Spring, could just provide a blueprint for life forms on Mars. Life forms that could still exist today. This is because the permafrost in Canada's high Arctic is extremely salty, cold, and mostly free of oxygen. It's pretty much the same environment that can be found on Mars. And so researchers with McGill University took a look at never-before-seen microbes in an attempt to understand alien life. By using the newest and most advanced genomic techniques, researchers demonstrated for the very first time in history that microbes living in an environment just like what we find on Mars can survive. These microbes are tiny, yet flourish by eating and breathing nothing except simple inorganic compounds. The same inorganic compounds that are found on Mars, for example, sulfate, sulfide, and even methane. This discovery near the North Pole is so exciting that samples of the sediments are now being used by the European Space Agency to test the instruments they'll use on their next Mars mission to detect possible life. Basically, proof of alien life has been found just under the North Pole, or at least the feasibility of such a thing. It's given scientists quite a lot of confidence that buried in the Martian soil, there will indeed be life forms. What do you think? Are you ready? Sponge gardens. Scientists recently discovered a surprisingly vibrant ecosystem growing in the Arctic Ocean near the North Pole. This rich and densely populated ecosystem consists of massive sponge gardens discovered near the peaks of long-extinct volcanoes. According to researchers on the vessel Polarstern, the life found here is some of the most basic on the planet and can be found everywhere from shallow tropical reefs to apparently the North Pole. Researchers discovered these fascinating animals by lowering a camera underneath the ice and then taking pictures of what's hiding on the bottom of the Arctic Sea. The pictures revealed sponge gardens, and they even managed to collect some samples. What they found truly shocking after analyzing the samples is that many of these living sponges are 300 years old or more. Scientists were surprised to find such an abundance of life because the environment isn't exactly what you would expect to produce such large life forms. Very little light penetrates the surface of the Arctic ice. There's almost no food, and scientists couldn't even figure out what the sponges were eating. It wasn't until they analyzed the samples that they realized the sea sponges act as microbial symbionts, meaning they feast on old organic matter. In simpler terms, they feed on the remains of animals that died thousands of years ago. These things are like fossil eaters, surviving by munching on the slowly decaying remains of creatures that went extinct thousands of years ago. Record-breaking dive. In the year 1958, a United States submarine became the very first vessel to ever reach the North Pole by traveling underneath the ice of the Arctic. It was on August 3rd, and the submarine also happened to be the very first nuclear submarine ever made. The commander of the USS Nautilus, William Anderson, wrote in his logbook, "Embarked following personage at North Pole, Santa Claus, affiliation, Christmas." While that seems pretty vague, the commander was just celebrating the occasion in a cryptic log in his book. Because, believe it or not, the first under-ice mission to the North Pole had been top secret, a covert op codenamed Operation Sunshine. Yes, it was a big deal for the world of science. But in the 1950s, it was a bigger deal for American pride considering the Cold War. Even President Dwight Eisenhower called it a magnificent achievement and sent his congratulations to the team. Unfortunately, they didn't find any monsters or strange life forms hiding in the North Pole. Instead, they proved the capabilities of nuclear-powered vehicles, because prior to the USS Nautilus, submarines had to surface or extend a snorkel above the water to take air into their engines and to charge their batteries for propulsion. But since they were running off a nuclear reactor, they never needed to go to the surface at all. By the time they reached the North Pole, they had already been underwater for 3 days. They didn't resurface again until they reached Greenland on August 7th. Land of the Gods. Cultures across the world have long believed the North Pole is a place of great magic. Many cultures also believe their ancestors came from the North Pole and that they had to begin migrating southward because of a great ice deluge 10,000 years ago. In the year 8000 BC, the original inhabitants of the North Pole supposedly traveled into Europe and Asia, built new settlements, and became the people of the world. In fact, there are at least half a dozen mythologies throughout the world that place their most sacred lands at the North Pole. Take the Vikings, for example. In Norse mythology, the land of immortality is at the North Pole. The Celtic myths describe heaven as being a place where the sun shines for 6 months continuously, which sounds quite a bit like the Arctic. The Greeks even called the North Pole Hyperborea, meaning above the north wind, and said it was a place where the sun shined 24 hours a day. The Italia Airship. The Italia was an airship that belonged to the Italian Air Force. Back in the 1920s, airships were all the rage. Since it was such a nightmare to get across places like the Arctic using a boat, scientists figured it would be easier to visit the North Pole in a giant balloon. This semi-rigid airship was designed and piloted by the Italian engineer Umberto Nobile. The expedition began on April 15, 1928. The airship left Milan with 20 people on board and 17,000 pounds of equipment. It took 30 hours to reach Germany, and after a brief rest, they continued on to Norway, then to the North Pole, where they crashed into a sheet of ice. One man died immediately, one died from exposure while waiting for rescue, and 6 crew members went missing because they got trapped in the envelope of the balloon as it floated away, never to be seen again. By the time the rescue operation was said and done in July of the same year, 17 people, including many of the rescuers, were left dead. The Italia was a huge disaster, and the remains of the airship are still missing somewhere in the Arctic. Arctic lightning. Lightning storms in the Arctic are not exactly common. In fact, one of the last things scientists expect to see in the North Pole are bolts of lightning coming out of the sky. This is because lightning is a phenomenon that occurs in warm weather. On a steamy summer in Kansas, you can expect some major lightning. But in the frigid wasteland of the Arctic, that just doesn't happen. At least, it never used to. For almost 2 decades, every lightning strike that happens has been monitored in real time by a special organization called the Worldwide Lightning Location Network. These scientists use a global grid of sensors to gather information on lightning strikes, things like frequency and distribution. The data collected over the past approximately 17 years shows a shocking increase in lightning around the North Pole. Actually, it shows dramatic changes everywhere in the Arctic region above 65 degrees north. According to Robert Halsworth, lead director of the WWLLN, lightning strikes have tripled in the Arctic from between 2010 and 2022. And yes, the lightning was actually detected very close to the North Pole, but only in 2019. It was an incredibly rare occurrence, and one we might see more of as climates continue to shift and the Arctic continues to get warmer. Canadian monster. A graduate student from the University of Manitoba recently discovered the very first genuine and scientifically real monster underneath Canada's Arctic sea ice. Near the North Pole, a beast was found with 8 bristly legs, a translucent body, 1 eye, 2 antennas, and no mouth. If that sounds terrifying, that's because it is. The only good news is that the monster is only 2 millimeters long. If you want to get a good look at this thing, you're going to need a microscope. Aurélie de la Forge didn't go seeking this monster out on purpose. She found it as more of an accident while searching for biodiversity way up in the Arctic. It's actually a type of copepod, a simplistic organism from the Monstruloida family. There are over 160 different types of Monstruloida found in the world's oceans, but this is the only one that lives in Canada's Arctic. De la Forge was studying the taxonomy of small ocean animals for her master's degree, and so she was already familiar with tiny marine creatures. When she was living at an ice camp not far from the North Pole, she was sampling the ocean as part of her thesis regarding plankton blooms under ice. And that was when she discovered the creature. It was a lucky chance, and shows just how much life there really is crawling across just about every surface of the planet. Strange blue lights. In 2019, some extremely strange blue lights were seen hovering above the Arctic Circle, not far from the North Pole. The mysterious blue lights, if NASA is to be believed, had nothing to do with aliens. Still, the lights definitely looked like some kind of bizarre alien phenomenon. It was photographers trying to catch a glimpse of the northern lights that took pictures of the blue, hazy orbs in the sky. About 15 or more of them were found in 2 clear spots in the otherwise empty atmosphere. Chad Blakely, the photographer who captured the amazing images, says he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He literally called it completely out of this world. While these may have looked like the bright blue discharge of some alien vessel, NASA says it actually had to do with a scientific experiment. The Andøya Space Center in Norway launched a pair of rockets that released metallic powder. The powder was released inside the northern lights as part of a way for scientists to investigate the conditions inside the aurora borealis. The metallic powder created a shocking light show, but it also helped researchers to track charged particles in the ionosphere. It's all for scientists to learn as much as they can about the processes which occur at the polar cusp of the Earth, where our magnetic field lines bend to spread across the atmosphere, and where space particles and solar wind meet. The most northern island. Scientists have just discovered the closest piece of land to the North Pole. It's the world's northernmost island, and it was revealed just recently thanks to some shifting pack ice. The discovery came, as so many do, completely by accident. Morten Rasch, head of the Arctic Station Research Facility in Greenland, said he and his team had gone to Udak Island to collect science samples. But after they arrived on the island, which was discovered by the Danish back in 1978, they realized they were at the wrong place. They missed their mark by about 3,000 feet. Of course, the island is incredibly small. It's only about 90 feet across and rises to a height of no more than 9 feet from the surface to the ocean. Still, it is technically the northernmost landmass in the world, which meant those explorers were standing as close as a person could stand on solid land to the North Pole. There could be more islands hidden underneath the Arctic ice, specifically the ice found just above Greenland. They have some of the thickest ice in the world, around 9 feet in the summer. And seeing as how the Danish government is trying to make a territorial claim of the North Pole, they are going to need all the islands they can get. The C-47 crash. In 2005, a team with the Canadian Forces carried out a sovereignty patrol near the North Pole, way up in the remote Canadian Arctic. They operated out of an abandoned weather station by the name of Isaacson, which can be found on Elif Ringnes Island. It was once part of the network of remote Arctic weather stations called JAWS, or Joint Arctic Weather Stations. It was built just after World War II and operated briefly by the United States and Canada. This area has some of the worst weather on the planet, or at least some of the coldest. The team's patrol included an exercise and emergency response simulating an Arctic crash. What makes this so interesting is that they use the wreckage of a U.S. Air Force C-47 as part of their exercise. The wreckage is that of a plane that crashed here in 1949. Over 50 years later, the plane hadn't moved an inch and was still sitting in the middle of the snow, just miles from the North Pole. From what we know, the C-47 was equipped with skis so it could land in the snow, and had originally touched down at the weather station to resupply. But overnight, frost had majorly accumulated on the aircraft. The crew, who weren't used to such harsh conditions, cleared the windshield but didn't clean the ice off the wings or the stabilizer. They then tried to depart using an airstrip only 4,200 feet long, while covered with about 5 inches of snow. Plus, they were reportedly 850 pounds overweight for a total of 28,850 pounds. The plane went airborne, the right wing dipped, and then they crashed into a riverbank. The C-47 got stuck, but luckily the crew escaped. The vehicle was just abandoned, and nobody ever went back for it. The LeoBelgium. Cartographer Michael Aitzinger created the first lion-shaped LeoBelgium map in 1583 as a way of supporting a shared national identity between the newly established Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. This place was previously regarded by other countries as more or less an inconsequential, isolated area under the rule of Spain's Philip II, who taxed the region heavily and gave them little in return. Aitzinger's design quickly caught on and grew in popularity. It also changed in accordance with the transforming political situation of the Low Countries. This included the modern-day Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, as the region battled back and forth with Spain for its independence. While the map was not necessarily geographically accurate, it represented something arguably more important at the time: the Dutch image and a sense of national belonging. The Blauw Map. Over 350 years ago, in 1663, the Dutch East India Company's master cartographer, Joan Blauw, created the first ever large-scale map of Australia, titled Archipelagus Orientalis Sive Asiaticus, or the Eastern and Asian Archipelago. The powerful company traded between Asia and Europe for 200 years and kept this information a secret. Maps were critical during this time period as there was a lot of competition and they held sensitive trading information. It is one of the rarest maps in the world, with only 4 known copies in existence. However, it is an incomplete map. It only features northern and western Australia and the southern Tasmanian coast. Representations of other areas, including much of the country's south and east coasts, are conspicuously absent because these areas weren't mapped until Captain Cook's voyage over a century later. There are a lot of details on the map, including ships showing Dutch or Spanish flags, which indicated who the territory belonged to. It also shows a whale with 2 spouts, so they most likely didn't know what the sea creatures looked like back then. When Blauw created the map, the Dutch weren't particularly interested in Australia, which they called New Holland, because it lacked the spices they were after. It wasn't much of a booming trade or commercial partner either. According to Libby Meltzer of the University of Melbourne, who helped restore a copy of the 354-year-old map, their encounters with the landmass were incidental and occurred along their voyages to the Spice Islands. The National Library of Australia acquired the map in 2013. It was discovered in a storage unit in Sweden in 2010 and was in such poor condition that restoration experts avoided even breathing on it. The Preservation Committee was worried it was going to fall apart just by looking at it. Unfortunately, the air and people touching it did end up causing considerable wear and tear to the artifact over time. However, a public appeal raised $100,000 to get the map restored in May of 2016. It was later sent to the Grimwade Center at the University of Melbourne, and the map finally went on display in 2017 after a painstaking 2.5-year restoration process. Earliest map of New York. In 1531, Genoese cartographer Visconti Maggiolo created one of the first ever world maps depicting early European voyages to the east coast of the United States. It features New York Harbor 80 years before the famed explorer Henry Hudson reached the eastern seaboard, and is one of the oldest maps to depict Ferdinand Magellan's travels. The 2x1 meter map, which was created on parchment made from goatskin, spent much of its 500-year existence rolled up, which thankfully kept its coloring and markings well preserved. However, it's incredibly inaccurate, featuring a mythical Sea of Verrazano, and also shows that Verrazano may have mistaken the waters off North Carolina as the Pacific Ocean. There are also various drawings on the map suggesting that its creator harbored imaginary visions about certain parts of the world. These visions include depictions of African kings who seem to have never really existed, as well as unicorns and dragons. In 2016, Daniel Crouch Rare Books put the map up for sale in New York City at an astounding price tag of $10 million, making it potentially the most expensive map ever privately sold. VOG Mueller Map. In 1507, in northeastern France, German cartographer Martin Mueller created the first ever world map that used the name America. Equipped with foresight that other mapmakers of the time apparently lacked, he not only drew the coastlines of places European explorers had recently discovered, he also drew entire continents and speculated about the existence of an ocean we now know as the Pacific. Mueller labeled one of these continents America, and was the first cartographer to envision North and South America as separate continents. He created the map less than 2 decades after Columbus's voyage to the New World, and a few years after Amerigo Vespucci sailed down the South American coast. To this day, researchers are unsure what inspired Mueller's idea of the Pacific Ocean. despite having access to information about the discoveries that inspired his map. Perhaps he was just too far ahead of his time. In Waldseemüller's later works, the Western American coasts and depiction of a second ocean were conspicuously absent, along with any mentioning of the term America. Only 5 copies are known to survive, including a 4x8-foot wall map owned by the Library of Congress, which had acquired it in 2003 for a whopping $10 million. Would you rather discover an ancient map of the Americas or find a crazy map full of mythical creatures? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. The Buache Map. French cartographer and map publisher Philippe Buache created his controversial map of Antarctica during the 18th century. Many people today claim that it features an accurate representation of the world's most southern continent before it was covered in ice. However, it was somehow created about 100 years before Antarctica was officially discovered. The map's full title is quite the mouthful. It's called the Map of the Southern Lands Contained Between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Antarctic Pole, where the new discoveries made in 1739 to the south of the Cape of Good Hope may be seen. Hopefully you don't have to remember that on a test. Its publishing date, which was either 1737 or 1739, is the first of many mysteries surrounding the map. One of Buache's many talents was his work as a theoretical geographer. This field of creative work involved using a combination of geographic knowledge, academic research, the journals of contemporary explorers, and astronomical information to create new maps. Buache made several accurate predictions, including the existence of the Bering Strait and Alaska. So many consider his Map of the Southern Lands to be a true-to-life depiction of Antarctica's subglacial topography. Some legends claim that he may have relied on an ancient map created by alien cartographers or some highly developed prehistoric civilization. The argument is that the continent of Antarctica could have been known by some advanced ancient civilization before it was rediscovered by modern humans in the 19th century. People believe that somehow he got his hands on their maps. There are also different ways to interpret his words, and he may have indicated that his map was just a hypothesis and not copied from some ancient atlas. Like anyone, Buache was not immune to error, and some of his predictions were wrong, including the existence of a central Antarctic Sea. There is also no way to gauge the accuracy of this map because even today's scientists are unsure what Antarctica looks like beneath the ice. It is also likely that another French explorer reported seeing icebergs during his journey to the south. So Buache drew them there, not knowing that Antarctica really existed. That doesn't take away from the fact that he was a pioneer and contributed greatly to the science of cartography. There were also 2 versions of this map, the first without the landmass and the second with it included. Perhaps Buache revised his theory based on what he had heard, or perhaps it is a forgery. The constant debates surrounding the map is what has kept it alive into the modern day. Insul Americane. Master cartographer Johan Blou from the Dutch East India Company, who created the first map of Australia, also created an unusual map of North America and the Caribbean called the Insul Americane in Oceano Septentrionale cum terris adiacentibus. In English, this translates to the American islands in the North Ocean with the adjacent lands. It was published in the 1635 German-language edition of Blau's Atlas Novus and is extremely rare due to its short lifespan. Blau created the Insule Americane based on one of his previous works called West-Indiske Passkaart, which is a sea chart of the Atlantic Ocean featuring Africa and America from the year 1630. He also referenced a rare map from 1631 by prominent Dutch cartographer Hessel Gerrits. Gerrits had previously served as the Dutch East India Company's primary hydrographer and map supplier. Blau took over the position when he passed away in 1632, and this newfound role gave him access to Gerrits' materials. This explains why his work was so heavily based on that of the man who previously held his position. It's unclear just how many original copies of Insule Americane still exist today, which makes this map an extremely rare find for collectors. Forma Urbis Romae. The Forma Urbis Romae, also known as the Severan Marble Plan, has kept historians and archaeologists busy for hundreds of years. It's an enormous map of Rome that was created between 203 and 211 AD, and towards the start of the 5th century, it fell into disuse. Over time, it was fragmented into thousands of pieces that were inadvertently scattered throughout the city and repurposed. For the last half-century, scholars have been gathering what they can and trying to make sense of it all. It's like the biggest puzzle ever. Thousands of pieces are still missing, making the task of reassembling the map a slow, painstaking process. So far, researchers have figured out that the 60 by 43-foot map was an incredibly detailed representation of 5 square miles of ancient Rome. It hung on the wall of a building that consisted of 150 marble blocks arranged in 11 rows. During the Middle Ages, the map was dismantled and pieces of it were reused in construction projects throughout Rome. The roughly 1,200 fragments scholars have recovered only represent between 10 and 15% of the entire map. The most recently discovered piece of the Forma Urbis Romae was found in 2016 during construction on a Vatican-owned building. It contains information about the Theater of Marcellus, as well as the Circus Flaminius, a little-known monument from the area. Researchers are hoping to better understand the layout and function of the map, and hopefully they can get their hands on more pieces of it. The VOG Map. In 2016, someone with an eye for valuable artifacts discovered a rare 17th century map of the world that had been found stuffed into a chimney in Aberdeen, Scotland during a home renovation. It had apparently been in this hiding spot for centuries and was most likely put there to block out drafts. The National Library of Scotland cleaned and restored the dirt-encrusted map. Unfortunately, it had been destroyed by the elements, as well as insects and vermin from over the years. It arrived at the library in a plastic bag, and whenever someone touched it, pieces fell off of it like confetti. The 7 by 5-foot map would have been a prized possession in the late 1600s and would have likely been owned only by the very rich. Dutch engraver Gerald Valk, the creator of this map, was one of the best in the world. And before it was rolled up and stuffed in the chimney, the map was just one of only 3 of its kind in existence. Large portions of it were lost due to its exposure to wear and tear, but the NLS restoration team was able to preserve what was left of it. The gentleman who discovered the map had thought it was worthless and almost threw it away before he turned it into the NLS, so it's kind of a miracle that it survived. Sedded Atlas. It's truly amazing what you can do on Reddit these days, and it turns out there are several Reddit boards dedicated to the appreciation of maps. In 2016, map enthusiast Anders Kvernberg from the National Library of Norway posted images of an unidentified map on the online platform. He posted a picture of an old Ottoman atlas that he found in the library's collection. He labeled it as an 1803 Ottoman world map, and explained that it was one of the library's 150,000 maps and atlases, of which only a few thousand are used every year. Nobody working at the library was literate in Ottoman Turkish, and their copy of the map was not digitally cataloged, so he didn't really have much more information on it. It most likely would have been put back on the shelf, except just a few weeks later, Anders had stumbled upon another Reddit post. What he happened to find was an image of a similar-looking Ottoman map, which was identified as part of the Sedded Atlas Türkümesi, the world's first Muslim-published atlas based on Western cartographic methods. It was published in Istanbul in 1803 as a resource for the Ottoman military, and only 50 copies were ever printed. Kvernberg alerted map expert Benedicte Gamborg-Brisa of his suspected discovery. To their delight, they confirmed that the library's copy of the Sedded Atlas is genuine. It's one of only 15 known surviving copies in the world. The hidden ecosystem. More than 1,600 feet beneath the Antarctic ice, scientists have just discovered a hidden world. An ecosystem never before seen by human eyes was found in an underground river, an unreachable world filled with creatures living in dark and jagged caverns. This subterranean habitat was found underneath the Larsen Ice Shelf, which is a huge floating chunk of ice attached to the eastern part of the Antarctic Peninsula. In 2021, A piece of this ice broke off and formed the biggest iceberg in the world. The discovery was made after researchers looked at satellite photos and saw an unusual groove close to where the ice meets the continent of Antarctica. Researchers identified it as a subsurface river, and then they drilled a hole approximately 1,640 feet deep to see what was inside of it. They were shocked when they came out on the other end inside of an underground chamber. They lowered their camera down there, and the video footage they recorded showed hundreds upon hundreds of shrimp-like creatures swimming around. Their lens was swarmed by little crustaceans called amphipods. It was a major shock because nobody had anticipated so much life so deep beneath the ice. According to Craig Stevens, a researcher with the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research in New Zealand, there is clearly an important ecosystem underneath Antarctica. He said the discovery had the scientists jumping up and down for joy. Although, because they only drilled a single hole into the cavern, we still don't know just how extensive the subterranean world really is. There could be even more creatures down there. Perhaps even creatures scientists have never seen before. The return of the fin whales. For the first time in almost 50 years, scientists have witnessed with their own eyes multiple large pods of fin whales feeding in Antarctica. According to the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research, this is a huge deal. After the blue whale, the fin whale is the biggest in the world, and ever since humans got on boats, they've been busy hunting them to extinction. By 1976, the fin whale had disappeared almost entirely from Antarctica, which was the year that commercial whaling was banned. But scientists and activists were still worried that the whales had been hunted beyond the brink of recovery. Now it looks like things are rebounding for these amazing animals. Even though they are some of the biggest creatures on the planet, they grow very slowly. It took nearly 50 years for the baby whales to grow to the size of behemoths and make babies of their own. Just recently, scientists and filmmakers documented groups of up to 150 fin whales back in their historic feeding areas. That's more fin whales than ever before. What this means in the grander scope of things has yet to be seen. Things are changing, but this could be the start of a whole new world in Antarctica, one rich with sea life. Frozen Belgian ship. The RV Belgica was the very first ship to be used on a Belgian Antarctic expedition between 1897 and 1899. It was also the first ship that wintered in the Antarctic region, at a time when exploring Antarctica was like exploring an alien planet. It was the first expedition at the beginning of the age of Antarctic exploration, and its mission didn't go quite as well as the men on board had hoped. On their way to Antarctica in January 1898, the ship reached Graham Land to its north, and on January 22nd, a man named Karl Vinke was washed overboard and died. But the expedition continued on, and they crossed the Antarctic Circle on February 15th. Days later, on February 28th, the expedition came to a hard standstill because the ship got stuck in the ice. They were trapped. The crew was poorly equipped to deal with winter, and they didn't even have enough clothing to keep themselves warm. There was also a major food shortage, and they were forced to hunt penguins and seals to survive. But what the crew hadn't anticipated was that with winter, the wildlife would flee, and they would be left in a wasteland without food and without aid. On May 17th, the perpetual darkness came. Polar night set in, and the crew didn't see the sun for almost an entire month. The men began to suffer from scurvy, morale dipped dramatically, and men started to go insane. Lieutenant Danko died from a heart condition on June 5th, and it was around that time that a group of men became completely nuts and walked away from the ship, saying they were walking back to Belgium. Almost a full year later, in January 1899, the Belgica was still trapped in ice. Terrified of spending another year trapped, the men used an explosive to blast a channel between the ship and a small patch of open water. After a month of hard work, they finally got away from the ice and sailed home, barely surviving the whole ordeal. Mysterious disk in the ice. A very strange disk has been discovered in Antarctica thanks to Google Earth. A man by the name of Scott Waring, who runs a popular YouTube channel that discusses alien conspiracies, was the one who uncovered the bizarre break in the Antarctic ice and the mysterious disk. In the satellite images, it looks as though the gigantic disc-shaped object had been trapped deep underneath the ice. And now, since some of that ice is broken, it's been revealed for the first time in who knows how many years. Although it's impossible to say what it is just by looking at blurry satellite images, Scott Waring is convinced it's a UFO. According to Scott, the disk is roughly 120 feet across and perfectly circular. It kind of looks like a plate of ice, but Scott says it's definitely a UFO that probably crashed in Antarctica and was frozen thousands, if not millions, of years ago. The gigantic terror birds. A fossil was discovered in Antarctica of one of the most terrifying creatures that ever existed. The fossil is currently the oldest known example of a gigantic bird that lived after the dinosaurs went extinct. It dates back 50 million years and was once part of a living pelagornithid. According to paleontologists, this bird had a wingspan of roughly 18 feet. It was huge. So big, it could have easily preyed on human beings like modern eagles prey on bunny rabbits. This bird lived in Antarctica when the continent was a whole different world. 50 million years ago, Antarctica was covered in trees. It was as warm as the Caribbean, and it was covered in prehistoric beasts. In order for such a large bird to exist here, it must have had ample food. Taking that into consideration, there would have likely been a complex ecosystem of thousands of different animal species. This world of giant birds and whatever other kinds of monsters lived in Antarctica lasted a very long time. According to experts from the University of California, Pelagornithidae evolved enormous bodies to better help them dominate the southern oceans of the planet. Their dominance lasted millions of years, and their bones are undoubtedly trapped underneath hundreds of feet of ice. As Antarctica continues to melt, paleontologists are hopefully going to find even more specimens, and maybe even larger examples of prehistoric birds. The unexplored island. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the quickest warming places on the planet. It is home to two of the biggest glaciers currently in existence. There's the Thwaites Glacier and the Pine Island Glacier, and both of them are quickly melting. As they melt, mysterious things are revealed underneath the fading ice. And recently, one of these discoveries was an unexplored island. The island was discovered in 2020 on February 24th by scientists surveying the glaciers around Pine Island Bay. It's tiny, only about 350 meters long, and is still mostly covered in ice. However, that ice is melting to reveal a layer of dry brown rocks. The island is made almost entirely of volcanic granite and was likely once part of an extensive reef system. Scientists have named it Sif Island after the Norse goddess, and they say it could be invaluable to their research. By investigating the mysterious island, scientists should be able to get a better idea of the lost world of Antarctica. They'll be able to see how the coastal reef used to function, and maybe even identify some wildlife that had once called the island home. The Field of Mummies. Chinese scientists in 2016 discovered a graveyard in Antarctica. Not a human graveyard though, but one filled with hundreds of mummified penguins. These animals weren't buried. They were left to desiccate and mummify on the frozen ground. The whole area has been described as a killing field, with up to 15 mummified penguin bodies per square yard. According to the latest figures from 2020, there are about 5.77 million breeding pairs of penguins in Antarctica. 5 out of the 18 penguin species call the continent home, with 4 more species living on subantarctic islands. Why in the world were there so many mummified dead penguins on one desolate stretch of land? It's a total mystery, and still is. It looked as if there had been a mass casualty event, some kind of intentional penguin slaughter. And here's where things get even stranger. This wasn't the only time that massive amounts of mummified penguins have been found in Antarctica. It happened again 4 years later in September of 2020. Researchers from the University of North Carolina found a mummified penguin colony that was exposed due to the melting ice. Something happened to an ancient nesting site of Adelaide penguins to wipe them out almost instantly. We still don't know what killed the penguins, the ancient ones or the more recent ones. Scientists say that this particular part of Antarctica has been home to penguins for thousands of years, and mass casualty events appear to keep on happening. But it's a complete mystery as to what's actually killing them. The Cave Oasis. NASA's Operation Icebridge made an extremely bizarre discovery back in 2019. Underneath the Thwaites Glacier in West Antarctica, they came across a giant underground cavern. This cavern is about the size of Manhattan, and it's like a warm cave oasis underneath the ice. Scientists with NASA were taking radar images of the glacier when they identified the cavern. It's located between the ice of the glacier and the bedrock underneath it, a kind of pocket filled with incredibly warm air. While the cavern would undoubtedly be beautiful to enter, a hollow space filled with beautiful blue crystal ice, like out of some kind of frozen fairy tale, it's really quite horrifying. The warm air in the cave, which is so unbelievably enormous, is helping the ice around it to melt much faster than scientists originally anticipated. This means the cavern will continue to get larger and larger. More of the ice will melt, and soon enough, the whole glacier will be gone. What happens if this glacier melts? Unfortunately, a lot of people will lose their lives. Scientists say that if the glacier melts and more warm caverns are discovered, the sea level will rise by about 2 feet. And once the Thwaites Glacier is gone, the rest will quickly vanish, and the sea level will most likely rise another 8 feet. Space rocks. In 1912, scientists collected the Italia land meteorite from Antarctica. It would be the first of 45,000 space rocks collected from the southernmost continent on our planet. Each space rock has a unique composition that gives scientists more evidence about the makeup of our solar system, as well as the earliest conditions out in the universe. But why in the world is Antarctica home to so much space debris? Scientists say it's all because of the Antarctic advantage. There is a massive contrast between rock and ice. Because most meteorites are black in color, they stand out like sore thumbs in the white landscape. It's also a very dry environment that helps preserve meteorites as if they are sitting in a freezer. This is even true for meteorites that fell to Antarctica over 1 million years ago. The whole continent is like an open-air refrigerator, preserving artifacts from space. Scientists can practically walk across the snow with a butterfly net and scoop them up. The biggest issue is that getting to Antarctica and searching through meteorite zones is difficult. The rocks are spread across the icy landscape of over 5.4 million square miles. Scientists estimate there could be as many as 300,000 meteorites waiting to be picked from the ice. It's just a matter of finding them. Mountain or pyramid. There is a mountain in Antarctica that looks an awful lot like a pyramid. It's huge and covered in snow, with perfectly pyramid-shaped contours, smooth and seemingly even sides, and a pointy peak, just like the Great Pyramid of Khufu in Egypt. It really does look as though one of the Giza pyramids was transported to Antarctica and then covered in a thick layer of snow and ice. But is this truly a pyramid, or is it just a mountain that looks like one? The answer, unsurprisingly, depends on who you ask. Eric Rignot from the University of California, Irvine, a man who is also a senior research scientist at NASA, says no. He told Live Science in 2016 that it's just an ordinary mountain, an unnamed peak in the Ellsworth Mountains with pyramid-like traits. He said it's not that strange for a mountain to take on such a shape. Even though scientists like Eric have vocally denounced the pyramid as an optical illusion, there are still plenty of people out there who believe it to be real. There are even some conspiracies floating around that say the pyramid is part of a long-lost Antarctic civilization, one that for some unknown reason, mainstream scientists are covering up. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching! Would you rather find a rare space rock or uncover a hidden pyramid? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!